Hey everybody, this is Eli with Elfbait. So, a lot of talk lately on Twitter, kind of going back to the topic of, how hard or easy is DMing. And so, I figured I would jump on and kind of weigh in my opinion on this. And this is something that, I tend to fall on the side of DMing really is not hard. It's just a matter of figuring out the simple points that make it seem difficult and tricky, and it really is pretty straightforward if you allow yourself to believe it is. And this is where I think a lot of problems come in, is that DMs or up and coming DMs, budding DMs, they look at it, they see all of this trickery that DMs who've been doing it forever pull out of their magic bag, and they think that it's some complex process, but it's not. It's a honed skill. It is a skill that has got some very basic stuff, and the only reason that the folks who've been doing it forever make it look easy to whatever degree that they do is that they have been doing it for a long time. But the basics don't really change. So before I started YouTubing, and actually when I first came back to actively DMing, I like to consider myself always a DM, even when I'm not playing, because I am a perpetual world builder and idea scribbler and adventure maker. I've always got something on the brew. I've created more campaign settings than I've ever run, just because I enjoy doing that. The craft of the DM, the GM. So before I started, I put my toe into the YouTube pool, and something that brought me back to actively gaming again is I caught a video by a gentleman that you may or may not know, Matt Colville. So Matt Colville had a wonderful video in which he used Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit as examples of styles of play, kind of railroading versus sort of a free-form game. And in discussions with some new DM friends of mine, and even growing up, with my little brother, who I taught to DM to a degree by having him play in my games through my kids, who have also taught how to do DMing. My nephew, who I talk to about DMing a lot as well. I have used the example of Tolkien's work in other ways, but I think that Matt's video was incredibly good at just kind of gelling down to play style. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to look at as well, as far as complexity of the DMing craft, and that is. And I hate calling it a craft because it makes it sound like something really lofty and special. The DM thing, the thing that DMs do, that me and Matt and all of the other folks out there who do, the Nerdarchy guys, they're all DMing. And while it is a craft, I hate calling it a craft because it really just makes it sound like something way more special and amazing than it is. So with things like, when I'm talking to folks and I'm trying to use references, like Matt Colville did, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings are good frames of reference. So, one of the things I always like to do, one of the sayings I always say when I'm talking to DMs about players who just won't bite, at hooks, or talking to players as a DM. For example, I always use the reference. I always like to say, at some point Bilbo has to leave the Shire. If he doesn't leave the Shire, there's no adventure. But that's not really much to do with the DM craft. So it just sort of establishing frame of reference. What I think both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit illustrate, as far as DMing as an element of the hobby and as a craft, is that big adventure, great campaigns are actually a series of smaller elements. And this is I think if I could really point out to anybody who's getting into DMing, that's the one thing to remember. You do not have to have it all figured out from the get-go. Having a greater idea of where you want things to go is great, but remember, it's those little elements that are going to keep people glued to the table and keep people coming back. You know, there is absolutely no reason that you can't start with a simple, dwarves visit the humble home of a hobbit, and start with your own series of encounters that build up to a greater campaign. Bilbo's adventures are a chain of weird little things that lead on to that are all part of this greater quest. I mean, the quest is spelled out very clearly at the beginning. We got to go to Lonely Mountain. We gotta defeat the dragon. We have to recover the dwarf's treasure. That, in essence, is like D&D. That's distilled to its most primordial essence. But all those encounters that happen along the way, those could have been anything, as long as they served the story and kept it moving forward. So yes, going back to DMing on that, if you're going to sit down and design a campaign arc, your goal, I would say you do best just to lay it down on a piece of paper. The goal is to get to the mountain, to get to slay the dragon, to get the treasure. Your starting point is in a humble village, whether that's the players are in the inn, the players live in that village. It could be anything, but kind of keeping it in context of the reference here. So from there, though, it's not important exactly if it's trolls that they meet where Bilbo finds Sting. It's not important whether or not all of the dwarves make it to the end. It's not important where are there spiders in your game or not. Do they go around Mirkwood? Okay, so they go around Mirkwood. What else do they encounter? So they don't encounter spiders, and they don't encounter the elves. We don't have the barrel scene. But what else is in there? And when you're DMing this, don't try to build too far out ahead. Your players are not necessarily going to want to go through Mirkwood. If the players understand that Mirkwood is full of elves who don't like trespassers, and there are giant spiders in Mirkwood, they may just say, no, we're not going to Mirkwood. We're going to go around Mirkwood. And if they go around Mirkwood, okay, cool. Well, then maybe their encounter is with orcs. Maybe their encounter is with goblins. Maybe their encounter is with some of the men of the world, and they have a little side quest. And that's the other thing, too. All of these big adventures are just a series of side quests. And if you're constantly focusing on the big campaign, it's going to seem daunting, and it's going to seem like heavy lifting as far as a DM goes. But if you focus on that first encounter with the trolls, and then that encounter with the elves, or the encounter in Goblin Town, with the Goblin King and all of that, those are all their own little dungeon crawls that form that greater campaign. And each of those dungeon crawls itself is then really broken into smaller elements. That whole scene with the trolls may not even be written in. You could see that really as maybe the result of a wandering monster table on a wilderness random encounter check. What do you run into? You run into 3 trolls camped around a fire. The chart might not have even said 3 trolls camped around a fire. The chart in any in any sort of product that you're using, or most likely in any random encounter table that you yourself are going to write, is likely going to say trolls, 1d4, 1d6. Now, the framework for that encounter is completely up to you as a DM. It doesn't have to be predetermined, and it actually can be very much flavored with what's going on in the rest of the campaign. So if your party is lost and they need to climb trees to find out what's going on, and that leads to a spider encounter, okay. Those spiders may have been another random encounter check. You know there are spiders in Mirkwood, but unless you actually have a planned encounter with a spider there, more than likely they're just going to be random encounters. Because really the goal of going through any of those areas probably has one particular reason, and then there's hazards. Excuse me. Throwing in some, and this is, random encounters, don't sell them short, because those trolls who are just a random encounter become a very memorable point in the game or in the story. But if you're looking at it from the context of a game, very memorable point in the game. The wizard in the party gets to shine. The thief in the party, he gets to showcase some of his skills, and the party finds some treasure. Now, it's possible that could have gone a completely different route. And this is where another key point for DMing it comes from. Another key element of the DMing craft is listening to your players. So in that troll encounter, there's a little cave where they find this loot. What if the party decides that they want to explore deeper into that cave? So you haven't really planned on there being anything to the caves, but they're really really set on going into those caves. Why not? It could be a few more rooms, a few more encounters, a little bit more in depth. It could also lead to prolonged dungeon crawl, but there's nothing wrong with that as long as you keep that little side quest on the right track. It's going to lead to down the road something very. It's still going to get you back to where you need to go. So, kind of rambly there, but that is my style, rambly. So the point there though is that an adventure like The Hobbit, or even something more grand like Lord of the Rings, is not, or does not need to be, some hammered out, well scripted, well organized adventure or campaign arc. All of those little adventures, all of those little encounters are really, as a DM, as far as you need to be thinking. Because you're not writing a book, because you're not writing a script where things have to flow a certain way, they have to make a certain sense, you really don't need to be planning too far ahead. And if you are going to plan ahead, plan in very broad strokes, very vague keynotes. Party has to encounter elves in Mirkwood. Okay, so the party has to encounter the elves in Mirkwood. Whether that's going through Mirkwood and, getting captured by them there, or whether that's going around Mirkwood and running into a patrol. An elven patrol that's patrolling the edges of Mirkwood sees the party skulking around and decides to bring them in for questioning. Maybe the party again tries to go around Mirkwood, but gets chased back into Mirkwood by something nastier. So in the context of a D&D game, this is not any claim to knowledge of what's in Middle-earth. This is actually more pulling it back to a D&D table. Go around Mirkwood, fine. You're out in the open countryside, a wyvern shows up. Now, as a low-level party, a wyvern is a bit of a task to defeat, depending on what edition you're playing. So that might send the players running for cover. Well, for any kind of big flying creature with large wings and stuff, trees are a pretty good cover. Wyvern doesn't have a breath weapon, so you don't have to worry about it lighting the trees on fire or splintering them with lightning or anything like that. So they end up back in Mirkwood. So remember, not to plan too heavily, just have your keynotes and let each session be its own thing. And make whatever session you're running weigh heavily, or not weigh heavily, draw heavily, excuse me, from the sessions that came before it. What the players did last time can inform a lot of where they should be going this next time. So, now that's a note on structure. You know, that's kind of me talking about DMing, the simple structure of DMing that often gets turned into something bigger. So yes, story arc, adventure arc does not have to be very daunting. Now, the other thing that people talk to me about a lot, and that I've actually answered questions a lot about, and I just want to let folks know, is that adventures don't all have to be amazing. They can be simple. They can be mundane. They can be things that have been done before to death. Cliche is not something to be avoided entirely in D&D. The entire game is built off of tropes and cliches. Your players are likely going to be coming to the table expecting tropes and cliches. If you have an elf player in your party, he's probably wanting to be Legolas nowadays. Maybe Arwen. Maybe whatever the made-up elf in the new Hobbit movie was. So the dwarf could have the love interest. Can't remember her name. Chances are that's where their brain is coming from. They may draw from a book or whatever, but just sticking to popular media. Now, if this was the 80s, that elf might have been Crow from Hawk the Slayer. That elf might have been any one of the ElfQuest elves from Wendy and Richard Peeney's amazing graphic novel series or comic series that got turned into graphic novels. One of the biggest influences on elves for me for the longest time, for sure. So, they're going to come to the table with a trope or a cliche in mind. So you can play to that. But also remember that many of your adventure ideas are also going to be troped and cliched out the wazoo and to high heaven. There's nothing wrong with you're in an inn, somebody comes screaming for help. There's nothing wrong with getting hired by a lord to do something. There's nothing wrong with stumbling on something. Weather can be a great motivator for adventure. Players are out on the road. They need to hide in a cave to get out of the weather. Oh no, something's in the cave. You know, the Conan the Barbarian movie. Conan the Barbarian movie, the Schwarzenegger one, not the Jason Momoa one, but the Conan the Barbarian has a great little, it's not an adventure, but it sure as hell could have turned into an adventure, where he's let free and he's crossing the plains and he's being chased by wolves, which are actually just really badly done, which are really just wild dog or trained dogs that don't look like wolves at all. But the scene is great. He runs across, he finds an old cairn, he crawls into the cairn to get away from the wolves, and he finds an old tomb in there. If you were to turn this into a D&D adventure, it doesn't need to be just one room with some old skeletons and a sword that somehow is perfectly viable as a weapon after centuries in the ground. It could have been an entire dungeon. Maybe that's the opening to a dungeon. Maybe it's a temple complex. Or that could be the hook to get your players on the adventure. A game like that might start out with, simple bit of setup. The players have received a message from an old friend asking them to come visit. While on the road, the weather turns sour. Seeking shelter, you find a nearby cave. Going into the cave, you realize that it is the entrance to an ancient tomb. Now, that tomb could be the whole adventure. That tomb could be the jumping off point from a rather mundane start where the players are like, okay, the adventure. So the players in this case are probably thinking the adventure is going to be when we get to our friend's house. We received a letter. The letter says, let's go with, please come and visit. Maybe the letter has some semi-important but not grave consequence. If it's got a grave consequence, your players aren't going to want to let go of it, and they're not going to want a side quest on that. So maybe it's a wedding, or an invitation to the local brew festival, where your friend has his first entry. It's his finest brew, and he thinks he's going to win. It's got some emotional context. It's got some oomph. Sets up an NPC. Could be used for later work. But now you got your players in this ancient tomb. And this ancient tomb, while it may not be the whole adventure, but it certainly could be. Talking about getting people into adventure with a simple trope, stumbling upon something. So maybe they're in the tomb, and while the tomb itself isn't the dungeon, in the tomb is some piece of material that is, a hook. There's an inscription on the wall. The runes on the sword being held by the ancient king speak of some place or a prophecy. Maybe there is treasure there, and something in the treasure points to greater treasure elsewhere. Whatever it takes to get your players into the actual adventure. Maybe desecrating the tomb imparts a curse upon the players. The curse is actually designed to spell out how to get rid of the curse, and so the players are now off on a jaunt to try and get uncursed because they tried to get out of the rain. It may seem silly, but your players are going to jump for it, and it doesn't require a lot of work. On the other hand, maybe the tomb is just a little side quest like the trolls from The Hobbit. Players go in there, they find a master-crafted sword and, in the hands of the skeleton. There's no curse, but maybe the skeleton in the tomb adds to your game world. And this is the other trick, too, for DMs, too. Little tidbits here and there build for a greater world. You've established an ancient kingdom underneath the layer of your current realm. So while they may not stay there, and while that may not be the adventure, it may not be the jump off to the rest of the adventure, it peppers the adventure with something interesting. So now they arrive at the friends, whatever the friend's letter was having them come to do, they get there and intrigue ensues. Or there are other encounters along the way. Goblins, spiders, bandits on the road. These are all very basic things you can throw in that can be made better or worse, or more or less important to help with the game. There is, kind of bringing it back, there is really nothing about DMing that is supernatural. It's just being able to recognize the opportunities. We all know what those opportunities are. I guarantee you, if you're interested in DMing, it's probably because you have a creative mind that comes up with stuff all the time. You've just convinced yourself that there's something else that you are missing that you really aren't. Listen to your instincts. If your instincts are saying they're in an inn, the innkeeper is dead in the morning, and one of the player's daggers is in his back, that sounds like a good old whodunit. And that's a great adventure. Many, 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 many novels, books, TV series, and movies, plays, poems, whatever, have been made. Board games, party games have been made built on that trope. And they keep getting made, and people keep eating them up. So there's something there. Don't be afraid of something like that. Your players aren't going to call BS that their dagger is found in the back of the guy. They're just going to go, oh crap, what happened? We got to find this out. Adventure. So, some people might complain that that's taking away player agency. You're not. You're not taking away player agency. You're involving the players. Somehow, somebody has tried to pull them into this web of murder and deceit. That makes your players very central. The agency that they're going to have in that is what they do next. But again, you get a very simple trope. mysterious murder, and go. Is it a plot by the local thieves guild? Is it a plot by the innkeeper's son, who wants the inn for himself? Is it a plot by the innkeeper's daughter, who wants to be free of her controlling father, who expects her to stay at home forever, but she wants to go off and be an adventurer? Not only is that a good plot device, she's a murderer. If she gets away, maybe down the road she's a competitor. She's an NPC. So adventures don't need to be amazing, world-breaking, brand new, never seen before. Some of the stuff that's come out, that's been published with huge spit and finish on it. Look at the current Tomb of Annihilation book. Tomb of Annihilation is an incredibly cool product in my opinion. It's a great setup for an entire campaign, and you could run the rest of your D&D game probably in that rich environment. It's captured the imaginations of everybody, but at its core, it is a trope. An evil curse has swept across the land. We have to stop the curse. That's it. You've heard it 1,000 times before. But here's this giant, awesomely put together book by Wizards of the Coast that has been played by people who adore the hobby, advanced DMs, new DMs, everybody's loving it. And it's built off of one of the tropiest tropes that ever troped. A world-spanning curse. Doom clocks, death clocks make for great campaign arcs. They establish a sense of immediacy. But the thing to remember is that's not an adventure trope. That's not an adventure arc. That's a campaign arc. All the tromping around in the jungle and fighting giant apes and ancient temples and lizard men and all of that stuff, that is where the adventure is going to be. And each one of those little adventures can be 5 encounters. It could be a single encounter. Whatever it takes to get you through your night of play, whatever it takes for you to feel your adventure, your DM juices flowing, and for your players to look at you like you somehow cast some sort of 9th level spell on them, some sort of, charm player spell, and if you don't, you move on, you'll learn. You're not going to always grip them and have them glued to their seat. Face it, some of the best stories out there have some real yawning moments where you're like, I'm sure the rest of the story is awesome, but right now I'm just not here. So, sure. It seems really big, but it's not. Keep it simple, and you will succeed. Do not feel you have to elevate yourself up right away to the levels of, love the show, but don't feel like you have to be Critical Role. Don't feel that you have to be me, and you've never seen me DM because I don't do any live streaming and stuff. Maybe someday, but I have to accomplish 2 things: acquire technology and not be absolutely camera shy and anxious. So, guys like Matt Colville, who have streamed, Dawnforge Cast, these guys have streamed. Guys from Nerdarchy, these guys stream. WASD20, Runehammer, could go on and on and on. Questing Beast. These guys are all great, and they've all got channels, and they make DMing look amazing. Full of tricks and high-end stuff. But all of that stuff comes from just understanding the basics of it. And every one of those guys has had a moment where they've gone to the table and they came away going, what did I do? Or the players are looking at them like, what did you do? and then you take you take notes, and you come back to the table with the next step. Anyways, I will probably talk more on this in the future, but best thing I can say to anybody who's going to be a DM, just be a DM. Just DM. Play in other people's games too, see how they DM. But if you're going to be a DM, just Nike trope, just do it. You know, the thing is that you got to get out there and you got to do it. You got to convince yourself that it's worth doing and that it doesn't require some master's degree in dungeon engineering to accomplish. So anyways, it's Eli from Elfbait. Comment below, like, share, subscribe. But most importantly, get out and game.